In the searing heart of the Matobo wilderness, where ancient granite copies shouldered a sky the color of bleached bone, Elias moved with the somber deliberation of a man performing a sacred, yet sorrowful, rite. The sun, a relentless hammer, beat down upon his weathered hat and the exposed skin of his forearms, drawing beads of sweat that traced paths through the dust clinging to him. Before him, in a shallow depression painstakingly carved from the unyielding, sun-baked earth, lay the reason for his grim labor, the still, magnificent form of a male lion. It was a creature he had known, not intimately, but as one knows the silent, powerful currents of a great river, a presence, a vital force in this land, now inexplicably stilled. He'd named him Ascari in his mind, the Watcher, for the lion's regal vigilance often observed from a respectful distance. The drought, a creeping desolation that had gripped the region for months, had claimed many, but Ascari's fall felt like a deeper wound to the land itself. Before we dive into Elias's harrowing discovery and the events that unfolded under that unforgiving sky, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you believe that even in the wildest heart of nature, moments of profound, unexpected kindness and resilience can occur, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that explore the raw, untamed edges of life. Elias had found Ascari near a phantom waterhole, a cracked mosaic of dried mud where life-giving water once pooled. There had been no struggle etched into the earth around him, no sign of a fight with a rival or the desperate last stand against a pack of hyenas. Just the lion, splayed out, his tawny coat dull, his immense chest unmoving. Elias, a man whose life was a lexicon of bush lore and animal behavior, had knelt, his heart a heavy stone. He'd pressed his fingers against the coarse fur beneath the jaw, searching for the thrum of life, however faint. Nothing. He'd laid his ear against the ribcage, listening through the oppressive silence of the drought-stricken land for the whisper of breath. Only the distant, mournful cry of a battler eagle circling overhead answered him. The eyes, usually burning with an amber fire, were half-closed, milky, and vacant. The great body was already cooling, though the morning was young. To Elias, it was the unmistakable signature of death, swift and silent, likely a final surrender to the insidious weariness of starvation and thirst. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the parched air, he had begun the arduous task. To leave such a noble creature to the scavengers felt like a betrayal. The ground, compacted and stubborn, fought his every thrust of the spade, each movement a small testament to his respect. Hours passed. The sun climbed, reached its zenith, and began its slow descent, painting the western horizon in hues of blood orange and bruised purple by the time he was finished. He stood back, his muscles aching, his shirt soaked through. A low mound of reddish earth, stark against the muted tones of the surrounding scrub, marked Ascari's final resting place. A profound silence settled, broken only by the rasp of his own breathing. It was a silence that felt too absolute, a void where a roar should have been. He offered a silent prayer, a simple farewell to a spirit he believed had departed. He turned, the tools heavy in his hand, and walked away, the image of the still lion seared into his mind. But the land, ancient and secretive, held its counsel, and beneath the freshly turned soil, something indefinable lingered, a spark refusing to be entirely extinguished. He dismissed the faint, nagging unease that prickled at the edges of his awareness as grief, a common companion in these harsh times. The bush was a place of stark truths, and death was its most frequent messenger. But something was about to shift in that silence, a tremor that would challenge everything he thought he knew. Elias was a man woven into the fabric of this wilderness. For over 2 decades, he had served as a ranger, his small, isolated station a tiny pinprick of human presence in a vast tapestry of untamed life. His skin was the color of the rich earth, mapped with the lines of sun and wind, and his eyes, though often narrowed against the glare, held a deep, reflective quality, mirroring the vast landscapes he roamed. He knew the rhythm of the seasons, the language of the animals, the subtle shifts in the wind that heralded rain or dust. His connection to this place was not one of ownership, but of quiet custodianship, a silent vow to protect and understand. He had seen life in its most vibrant expressions and death in its starkest forms. He prided himself on his observational skills, his ability to read the almost imperceptible signs that the bush offered up to those patient enough to look. The death of Ascari, while sorrowful, had seemed straightforward, another casualty of nature's unpitying cycle. The antagonist in this unfolding drama was not a creature of fang and claw, but the environment itself. The drought had leached the color from the landscape, leaving behind a palette of browns and grays. The air was thick with dust, the sun a malevolent eye in the sky. Water sources had dwindled to muddy seeps, then to cracked earth, forcing animals into ever-increasing competition for dwindling resources. Weakness invited predation, and even the strongest, like Ascari, were not immune to the slow, inexorable drain of energy, the gnawing emptiness of hunger, the burning torment of thirst. Elias had seen it in the sunken flanks of the zebra herds, the desperate foraging of the baboons, the eerie silence in places that once pulsed with life. He remembered the moment he found Ascari again, the details sharp and clear. The lion lay on his side, a dusting of pale soil already clinging to his fur. His massive paws, usually so purposeful, were relaxed in a way that spoke of finality. Elias had run a hand along the powerful flank, feeling the coolness that had already begun to seep into the limbs, a stark contrast to the sun-warmed earth. He'd lifted a heavy paw, noted the lack of any reflex, the utter limpness. He'd even gently tried to open an eyelid further, peering at the dull surface of the cornea. All signs pointed to the irreversible. There had been a faint, almost imperceptible tremor he'd felt as he first touched the lion's shoulder, but he dismissed it as a post-mortem muscle spasm, a final electrical discharge from the fading nerves, something he'd witnessed before in other animals. Or perhaps, he'd thought, it was merely the trembling of his own hand, a reaction to the somber discovery. The silence from the great chest was absolute. The Matobo Hills spread around him, a labyrinth of granite whalebacks and balancing rocks, interspersed with thickets of acacia and mopane. It was a land of harsh beauty, where survival was a daily struggle, a testament to the tenacity of life. Elias's patrols were long and solitary, his old Land Rover a familiar rumble against the backdrop of cicada calls and distant bird cries. He felt the weight of responsibility for this area, a silent guardian against poaching, a monitor of the delicate balance. The burial of Ascari had been an act of respect, a way to prevent the indignity of the great cat being torn apart by scavengers, though he knew it was merely delaying the inevitable return to the earth. He had chosen a spot shaded by a cluster of wild syringa trees, their leaves brittle and dry, offering scant protection from the relentless sun. The soil here was a little softer, a small mercy in the back-breaking work. As he drove away that day, he'd glanced in his rearview mirror at the lonely mound, a small scar on the vast face of the wilderness. A sense of unease, a tiny, illogical whisper, had suggested he should have done more, checked again. But what more could be done for the dead? He'd shaken his head, chiding himself for sentimentality. The bush demanded pragmatism. 3 sun-scorched days crawled by, each one a mirror of the last, under a sky that offered no promise of relief. Elias continued his rounds, his thoughts often drifting back to the fallen lion. The image of Ascari in his prime, a magnificent beast with a mane like a dark corona, was a stark contrast to the still form he had laid to rest. On the 4th day, his patrol route, dictated by the need to check a distant, rapidly failing borehole, brought him along a track that skirted the area where he had buried the lion. He hadn't intended to go near the precise spot. There was a certain sanctity to such places, a desire to let the dead rest undisturbed. But as he navigated a particularly rough patch of terrain, his gaze swept across the familiar cluster of syringa trees, perhaps half a kilometer distant. Something was different. It wasn't a dramatic change, nothing that would scream for attention, but a subtle anomaly in the landscape that his experienced eyes registered instantly. A flicker. He slowed the Land Rover, pulling off the track into the thin shade of a camelthorn tree. He reached for his binoculars, his heart giving an odd, unexpected thump. Raising them to his eyes, he focused on the spot. The mound of earth was still there, but it seemed altered. Not lower, as he might expect from scavenging animals digging down, but almost fractionally higher in one section. And was that a dark patch near the crest of the mound, a discoloration that hadn't been there before? He dismissed it. Perhaps a trick of the light, the play of shadows in the intense midday sun. Or maybe some nocturnal animal, a porcupine or an aardvark, had been investigating, its digging creating a new contour. He lowered the binoculars, a frown etching itself deeper into his brow. His initial unease, the one he had suppressed after the burial, returned with a sudden, sharp clarity. He remembered the almost imperceptible tremor he'd felt on Ascari's shoulder. What if? No, it was impossible. He had been thorough. Death was death. Yet, the image of that slightly altered mound, the vague sense of wrongness, pulled at him. He tried to reason it away. He was tired, the heat was oppressive, his mind was perhaps playing tricks on him. But the disquietude was a hook that had snagged deep. He put the Land Rover into gear, a new, unwelcome tension coiling in his stomach. He decided to make a small detour, just to satisfy himself that it was nothing, to lay the ghost of this absurd notion to rest. As he drove closer, slowly, carefully, over the uneven ground, the sense of foreboding grew. The air itself seemed to hum with a strange expectancy. He parked the vehicle a respectful distance away and approached on foot, his boots crunching softly on the dry leaves and twigs scattered beneath the syringas. The closer he got, the more pronounced the anomaly became. The surface of the mound was indeed disturbed, not by the systematic excavation of a scavenger, but by a subtle, upward pressure from beneath. A small, almost conical protrusion of loose earth had formed near the center, like a miniature volcano. And there was a faint, damp patch spreading from it, darkening the reddish soil. Elias stopped, his breath catching in his throat. His mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Trapped gases from decomposition? Unlikely to create such a focused pressure point after several days in this heat. An underground spring, suddenly erupting? Impossible in this drought-stricken area. Then, as he stood there, transfixed, a small puff of dust, no bigger than his fist, erupted from the very tip of the protrusion. It was soft, almost gentle, but it was undeniably movement originating from within the grave. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the profound stillness. Scavengers dig down, they don't push up. The impossible, terrifying thought that had been lurking at the fringes of his mind now lunged forward, seizing him with an icy grip. Elias felt a wave of dizziness, the blood draining from his face. He stumbled forward, his legs suddenly weak. "No," he whispered, the sound swallowed by the vast indifference of the bush. "It cannot be." He knelt beside the mound, his hands hovering over the disturbed earth. He could feel a faint vibration through the ground, a subtle tremor that seemed to pulse with a desperate, struggling energy. He pressed his ear to the soil, his mind reeling. And then he heard it, a sound so faint, so muffled, it was almost imperceptible. A rasping, scraping noise, followed by a weak, shuddering exhalation, like air being forced through a constricted passage. It was the sound of something breathing. A strangled cry escaped Elias's lips. The implications crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. Guilt, horror, and a wild, desperate hope warred within him. He had buried Iskari alive. The lion he had mourned, the creature he had respectfully committed to the earth, had been clinging to a thread of life, entombed by his own hands. The tremor he dismissed, the shallow breathing he hadn't detected, the coolness of the body, perhaps a state of deep torpor induced by extreme debilitation, all his careful observations, his years of experience, had catastrophically failed him. There was no time for self-recrimination, not now. Adrenaline surged through him, a jolt of pure, frenetic energy. He scrambled back to the Land Rover, his mind a chaotic whirl. His spade, the same one he had used for the burial, was still in the back. He grabbed it, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the handle. He raced back to the mound, his heart pounding in his ears, drowning out all other sounds. He began to dig, frantically, heedlessly, the spade a blur of motion. Clods of earth flew, scattering around him. The sun beat down, forgotten. Thirst, exhaustion, the searing heat, none of it registered. His only focus was the earth in front of him, the imperative to undo his terrible mistake. He dug with a desperate strength he didn't know he possessed, his movements fueled by a potent cocktail of guilt and a fragile, burgeoning hope. With each thrust of the spade, he muttered apologies, pleas, prayers. "I'm sorry, Iskari. Hold on. I'm coming." The loose topsoil gave way quickly, but then he hit the more compacted earth beneath. His progress slowed. He was terrified of striking the lion, of causing further injury. He moderated his pace, his digging becoming more controlled, yet no less urgent. He used the spade to loosen the earth, then often resorted to his bare hands, scooping away the soil, feeling for any sign of the lion's body. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. His muscles screamed in protest. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, his searching fingers touched something soft, yet resistant, covered in coarse hair. Fur. Caked with damp earth, but undeniably fur. A choked sob escaped him. He was close. He worked with renewed frenzy, clearing the soil around the area. Slowly, painstakingly, a patch of tawny flank was revealed. It was still, unresponsive. He pressed his ear against it, his breath held in an agony of suspense. Silence. A crushing, devastating silence. Had he been wrong? Was this just the earth settling, some cruel trick of his overwrought imagination? Despair washed over him, cold and suffocating. He sagged, the spade falling from his nerveless fingers. Perhaps he was too late. Perhaps the faint sounds he'd heard were the last vestiges of a life finally, truly extinguished. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. The weight of his error, the horror of what he might have done, was a crushing burden. He felt a profound emptiness, a desolation that mirrored the parched land around him. He had failed. Failed the lion, failed himself, failed the spirit of the wilderness he held so dear. But then, as he knelt there, defeated, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement beneath his hand. A flicker. He froze. His eyes snapped open. He stared at the exposed patch of fur. Had he imagined it? He pressed his hand flat against the lion's side, concentrating with all his being. There it was again! A shallow, stuttering rise and fall. A breath. Faint, weak, barely there, but undeniably a breath. A surge of adrenaline, more potent than before, shot through Elias. He wasn't too late. Askari was alive. Buried, starved, deprived of oxygen, but somehow, miraculously, still alive. The sheer improbability of it, the lion's incredible tenacity, filled him with a renewed, almost savage determination. He snatched up the spade again. The guilt was still there, a burning coal in his chest, but now it was overlaid with a fierce, protective urgency. He had to get him out. He had to save him. The digging resumed, more careful now, more precise. He focused on uncovering the lion's head and chest, knowing that airway was paramount. The soil was heavy, clinging. His arms ached, his back screamed, but he pushed on, driven by the fragile pulse of life beneath the earth. He uncovered a massive shoulder, then the powerful neck, still caked in dirt. He worked around what he judged to be the head, his fingers gently probing. Finally, he cleared the earth from around the great muzzle. It was packed with soil. Gently, so gently, he used his fingers to clear the nostrils, the mouth, wiping away the clinging dirt. As he worked, he talked to the lion, his voice low and soothing, a constant murmur of encouragement and apology. Hang on, old friend. Just a little longer. I'm here. I'll get you out. He didn't know if the lion could hear him, if it was even conscious, but the words were as much for himself as for the entombed animal. The sun climbed higher, the heat becoming almost unbearable. There was no shade here, only the relentless glare. Elias felt his own strength beginning to wane. His movements became slower, more labored. He paused, gasping for breath, his vision swimming. He took a swig of precious water from his canteen, splashing some on his face. He looked at the partially uncovered form of the lion. So still, so terribly still. Doubt, a cold serpent, began to coil around his heart again. Was the breathing he'd felt just a final, reflexive spasm? He shook his head, trying to clear the fog of exhaustion and despair. He had to keep going. He owed Askari that much. He redoubled his efforts, digging around the lion's torso, trying to free the immense weight. The earth seemed to cling to the lion, reluctant to release its prisoner. It was like trying to excavate a statue of immense weight, a dead, unyielding burden. He tried to shift a foreleg, to create some leverage, but it was impossibly heavy. He was a strong man, but the sheer mass of an adult male lion, combined with the clinging soil and his own exhaustion, was almost overwhelming. A moment of pure panic seized him. What if he couldn't do it? What if he wasn't strong enough to free Askari before it was too late? The distant sound of a vehicle, faint and far off, reached his ears. Another ranger patrol? Tourists? He dismissed the thought. He was too remote. It was likely just the wind playing tricks. He was alone in this. He focused on one section at a time, clearing earth from beneath the lion's body, trying to create space. He used the spade as a lever, wedging it beneath the lion's flank, putting all his weight into it. The earth groaned, shifted slightly. A small victory, but it spurred him on. He worked like a man possessed, oblivious to the cuts and scrapes on his hands, the protesting ache in every muscle. The world narrowed to this small patch of earth, this desperate struggle between life and oblivion. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of grueling labor, he managed to clear enough earth from one side to attempt to roll the lion. He positioned himself, braced his feet, and pushed with all his might against the lion's flank. For a moment, nothing. Then, with an agonizing slowness, the huge body began to move, to tilt. He pushed harder, grunting with the effort, his vision blurring. The lion rolled, ponderously, out of the shallow depression of the grave and onto the relatively level ground beside it. Elias stumbled back, gasping, his legs trembling violently. He sank to his knees, every muscle in his body screaming. He stared at Ascari, now fully free of the earth that had been his tomb. The lion lay on his side, his fur matted with dirt and sweat, his breathing still frighteningly shallow, almost imperceptible. But he was out. He was free. A wave of exhaustion, so profound it was almost paralyzing, washed over Elias. He had done all he could physically do for now. He crawled closer to the lion, his movements slow and stiff. He gently wiped more dirt from Ascari's face, his fingers trembling. He spoke softly, words of reassurance, of hope. "You're safe now, Ascari. You're safe." He pressed his ear to the lion's chest again. The heartbeat was there, faint, thready, but persistent. And the breathing, though shallow, was a little more regular than before. He had to get water into him. Dehydration, after days without liquid, would be critical. He fumbled for his canteen, his hands clumsy with fatigue. Unscrewing the cap, he poured a little water into his cup palm and carefully, slowly, brought it to the lion's lips. He let a few drops trickle into the side of Ascari's mouth. The lion didn't respond, didn't swallow. Elias tried again, gently parting the lips, letting the water moisten the parched tongue. Still nothing. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced through his exhaustion. Had the lack of oxygen caused irreparable damage? Was he merely prolonging the inevitable? He sat back on his heels, despair threatening to engulf him once more. The sun beat down mercilessly. The silence of the bush pressed in, heavy and expectant. He looked at the magnificent creature before him, so terribly reduced, so vulnerable. A king brought low, not by a rival, but by a catastrophic mistake, by the cruelty of circumstance. The guilt was a raw, open wound in Elias's soul. He had to try something else. He thought of his emergency kit in the Land Rover. A syringe, perhaps he could try to get some water in more directly, but the risk of aspiration was high. He simply stayed there, beside Ascari, his hand resting lightly on the lion's flank, feeling the faint rise and fall of his breathing. He shielded the lion's head from the worst of the sun with his own body, creating a small patch of shade. He murmured to him, a continuous stream of gentle sound, hoping that his voice, his presence, might offer some small comfort, some anchor to the world of the living. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The only sounds were Elias's own ragged breathing, the distant buzz of insects, and the almost inaudible breaths of the lion. Then, a change. A tremor ran through Ascari's massive frame. Not a spasm of death, but something else. A cough. A weak, rasping, shallow cough that nevertheless shook his whole body. Elias's head snapped up, his heart leaping. The lion's eyelids fluttered. Once, twice. Then, slowly, incredibly, one amber eye, filmed with dust and exhaustion but undeniably alive, flickered open. It was unfocused, glazed, but it was open. The lion took a slightly deeper breath, a shuddering intake of air that seemed to travel through its entire body. Elias felt tears spring to his eyes, tears of relief so profound they were painful. He leaned closer, his voice thick with emotion. "Ascari, can you hear me, old friend?" The lion's eye didn't focus on him, but there was a subtle shift, a twitch of an ear in his direction. It was the faintest of responses, but it was enough. It was a sign. He quickly offered water again, cupping it in his hand, bringing it to the lion's lips. This time, there was a flicker of the tongue, a weak, almost imperceptible lapping motion. A few drops were taken, then a few more. Elias's hand shook as he continued to offer water, little by little. The lion swallowed, a faint ripple in its throat. It was a small victory, but in this desperate situation, it felt monumental. He knew the lion was far from safe. Ascari was incredibly weak, emaciated, and likely suffering from a host of complications from his ordeal. He would need veterinary attention, careful monitoring, a long and difficult recovery. Elias reached for the radio in his Land Rover, his movements still stiff. He'd call the base, report the situation, request immediate assistance from the wildlife vet. But for this moment, watching Ascari take those first, tentative sips of water, seeing the flicker of life in those incredible eyes, Elias felt a profound sense of gratitude, of awe. He continued to sit with Ascari, gently stroking his dusty mane, speaking to him in low, soothing tones. The lion remained mostly still, conserving what little energy he had, but his breathing grew steadily stronger, deeper. The glazed look in his open eye began to clear, replaced by a dawning awareness, though it was still clouded by profound weakness. At one point, Ascari made a tiny sound, a faint, breathy sigh that was almost a whimper. Elias's heart ached. He could only imagine the confusion, the pain, the terror the animal must have endured. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in softer hues, Elias kept his vigil. He had managed to get more water into the lion, and Ascari seemed to rest more comfortably, his breathing evening out. He had made a makeshift shade canopy using a tarp from his vehicle, protecting the lion from the last of the day's heat. He knew this was just the beginning of a long road. The vet would assess, decisions would be made. But in this quiet moment, surrounded by the vast, ancient landscape, a fragile bond had been forged, born of a terrible mistake and a desperate, miraculous rescue. The great Ascari, the Watcher, had been given a second chance, pulled back from the very edge of oblivion by the hands that had, in error, placed him there. The vast silence of the savannah returned, but this time it was filled not with an ending, but the faint, persistent whisper of a heartbeat, defiant against the dust. Thanks for watching. If this story of improbable survival and the deep connection between man and wilderness touched you, give it a like and subscribe for more wild moments of wonder.